So I've started reading the Quran and I've actually wanted to share some of my first impressions of the book. I've finished the opening section, which is quite short, and the first long section after that. It's called Al-Baqarah, but I guess you shouldn't care about that. Now, of course, I'm not a Quran scholar, I'm not an expert, but I have dealt with some philosophical ideas before, and I've also used some commentary when reading the verses. Now, one thing that is very important to understand about the Quran is that Muslims actually believe that the book is Allah's divine speech, meaning that Allah made Muhammad, the prophet, recite the Quran, and actually the Quran itself, the text, is God speaking directly. It is, in a sense, God. And it's important to understand when we go into this religion that while Christianity worships, well, a person or a God, right? Jesus, but Jesus is also a person. Well, he's a character in a sense, and it's a character in a story, right? And Jews would, well, the Hebrew Bible goes, the main character of the Hebrew Bible is the people of Israel, right? The Hebrews, the ancient Hebrews, these are the main characters. In the Quran, it's different because the book itself is the subject of worship, in a sense. I do get that it's the same in Christianity and Judaism, but in Islam, it goes a step further because the book is, in a sense, God. It's not just holy, it's also God, in a sense. And if we keep comparing it to the Bible, what we also get, at least as far as I've read, is that the Quran reads more like a set of instructions than like a book with a story. For example, if you take the Bible, both the Old and the New Testaments, what you get is a series of stories. What happens when, and who talks to who, and who says what, and then something happens, and then another thing happens, right? It's a story. We can all talk about these stories. I can tell you about the Garden of Eden, or about the Tower of Babel, or about the flood, and you'll all know what I'm talking about. But the Quran reads more like an instruction manual, like you will read what you should do with your poor, and what you should do with your wife, and how you divorce, and how you should worship, and what should you believe, and what shouldn't you believe, etc., etc. For example, the Quran keeps coming back to the notion that Allah knows everything that we're doing. It keeps repeating that many, many times, at least in the parts that I've read. And it also keeps telling us that Allah teaches us in the Quran. He teaches us stuff that we could not know before, which is interesting because that means if the book is holy and if it is indeed divine speech, that actually means that humans are, you could say, incapable of governing themselves in a sense, and that could explain some of the enmity of the Islamists to the liberal world order, right? Because, I mean, what is a parliament? A parliament is a bunch of people, humans, dictating laws for humans, when you really shouldn't need that if you have a holy book that's been dictated by the absolute good creator of the cosmos, right? You shouldn't need to get a bunch of people to think together and come up with laws and rules because you already had Allah give you a revelation of how you should behave and of how you should conduct a society of believers, right, of Muslims. Now, another thing that keeps recurring in the book is how Allah is all-merciful and all-wise. I've already said that it's always referred to how He knows everything, but it also keeps saying how all-merciful Allah is, which is curious because I also see a lot of references to, well, eternal fire, which I'm just going to refer to as hell, although even though I didn't see it being referred to as hell in the text itself, but it keeps referring to fire and eternal fire and, well, divine punishment or divine reward if you act properly. Now, I guess you guys could tell by the way that I'm speaking right now that I personally have not yet been convinced that this text is divine. I do not believe that this text is the literal word of the creator of the universe. I think that it would be more apparent that it is if it was. That being said, however, I am going to keep reading it, and of course, if it is indeed the word of God, I would like to know that, and I would like to be convinced of that if it is true, although I don't think it's true. Now, I do realize that by saying this, the book says, which means God directly says that I am going to hell for all eternity. And there are actually some verses that explicitly state that even if I might think that I'm going to hell just for a little bit of time, I'm actually going to hell for eternity, right? There is no forgiveness for this crime that I'm committing right now. Now, there's a whole theme of hostility towards non-believers. It keeps referencing how these people are going for eternal fire and you're not allowed to marry them. You even should marry Muslim slaves and not free people who are not Muslims. And you should fight non-Muslims wherever you find it, although I guess that particular verse could also be interpreted as only when you're in war or something like that. And also there's a lot of talk about the final day, I guess the day of judgment in a sense. I haven't quite figured out exactly what happens in the day of judgment. Maybe I haven't gotten far enough, but it is referenced over and over. And also, well, the thing about what happens after we die. If we were good people in life, which means good Muslims in this case, we will get boundless rewards. And if we were bad people, and especially if we were non-believers, and especially if we were people who have heard the word of God, like I just did, and are still non-believers, then we get the worst punishment. We basically spend eternity in the fire, which is, well, I'm not looking forward to that. Now, there's a lot of talk about the Jews. They're called also many times Banu Israel, the sons of Israel, the people of Israel. I guess that would be the correct way of interpreting it. Now, the reason that there is so much enmity towards these people is because, according to the book, if I understand it correctly, they have gotten the first revelations, right, with Moses and then Jesus, who also came to the people of Israel in Judea, of course. Jesus was a Jew, and the people have corrupted, essentially, the Bible, the text. They have turned away from Jesus, and now they're not even listening to Muhammad, the prophet. So basically, the Jews have done everything wrong, and on one hand, they're not as bad as the polytheists, but on the other hand, they kind of suck. So there's also a lot of talk in the Quran about how these people are going to hell, which is, yeah, I guess it's sounds about right. There's also a lot of talk about how you should give to the poor and stuff like that. So it's not all threatening and fire, but my experience has been, well, mostly of fire. Now, as I've said at the beginning, I am not a Quran expert. This is my first time going through it in full. I bet many people will try to correct me on some things or maybe, well, wish me luck in hell, but I'm sharing my thoughts with you, and I hope you found this helpful and useful, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.